Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming out today. And I think what we're going to do on the format is that I'll just give you a quick overview of my journey to get to this point, and say a couple of things about this book, which I've had to resign to publish. And so I'll explain a bit about that. But what I'm most interested in then is getting the conversation into more of a Q&A. But in particular, you know, I've been doing these events now this last week, and at every single event, people have spoken to me about Google. I've been talking to them about power, and they've come right back at me and talked about Google. And I really want to just reflect on what that means in terms of a power transition, and what there is that we can do together in that space, what the challenges are, and there are huge challenges around trust, authenticity, and authority there that I'd love to talk about. But really just to open it up at that point. And we can talk about just about anything you'd like to, whether it's this crazy period of 4 years working with those 3 prime ministers, the end of Blair, the whole of Gordon Brown, and the first year of David Cameron, or then the 4 years after that when I was in Beirut, and trying to use these amazing new tools, the smartphone superpower, to do diplomacy in a different way, and to connect with people in a way that we'd never been able to do before. And I can give you some examples of how all that happened. If you want, we can go back further. We can talk about my life as a failed boxer. I lost a boxing match in Nairobi to the mayor, and they had T-shirts made up saying Fletcher goes home on a stretcher, which I pretty much did. We can talk about my career as a failed lead singer for Freshly Squeezed, very much ahead of their time, or indeed anything you'd like to cover. So the book, Naked Diplomacy, clearly no real nudity involved. The idea, stolen really from Jamie Oliver, is what does diplomacy look like in the way that he did with cooking? If you take away all of the paraphernalia and all the crap that holds us back. And we've constructed around diplomacy, which is a very kind of maps and chaps world, a load of etiquette and protocol and language, which I'm arguing isn't helping us to connect with people. But in a way, you know, I'm preaching to the choir here because you're disrupting us in that space already. And one of the things I say to diplomats is unless we find a way to communicate more effectively and to use these new tools and to strip away a lot of this rubbish, the kind of platitudes about, you know, Britain and Cambodia have warm bilateral relations on a range of mutual and that stuff that just switches you off immediately. Unless we can shift all of that, scrape those barnacles off the boat, then you, and we often use Google in this context, will disrupt us even more. And I often ask people, who do you think will be more powerful in 10 years' time? Google or Britain? Who would you have on the Security Council in 10 years' time? Google or Britain? And increasingly people, we do a show of hands. I won't do it here because you're all very loyal. and you know, word would go back very quickly to Eric that on whoever voted for Britain. But you know, the number of hands that go up for Google is increasing every time I ask the question. So that's the idea of the naked in Naked Diplomacy. And obviously, because I'm trying to sell a book, we do chuck in a few stories about nudity anyway. There's the story about when my son turned up at the PM's house as a 4-year-old, completely naked, and the housekeeper came to the door and said, "You're the first guest the Prime Minister has ever had arrive naked." A sign of how professional the British Foreign Service is. There's a story in there about the time I was at the G8 summit with David Cameron, his very first summit. And I don't know if it's like this in your world, but there's a kind of physicality and theatricality to the way that leaders interact. Think of Putin on his horse and so on, and his tank. And so I took David Cameron swimming in the lake at Muskoka in Canada, so that then we could brief the other delegations, right? There's a new kid on the block here, strong and young, a bit like the Justin Trudeau effect now. So we did all that, briefed the other delegations, fantastic. Word went round, and when he arrived at the meeting, Obama was feeling his muscles, and Sarkozy was looking a bit jealous, and so on. Perfect. And then Berlusconi saw this, and was a bit sort of put out that someone else was stealing that space, and so disappeared off and came back 10 minutes later with a stack of photos of himself, lightly oiled, and wearing a pair of very, very tight Speedos. They were red, I think, though I don't like to remember the moment too much. I've been trying to forget it ever since. And handed them round. And for the only time in my experience, the leaders of the free world were completely silenced. But the only other moment of nudity in there, I'm afraid, is actually more of the core idea of the book, which is that the very greatest diplomat was actually the very first diplomat, and he was maybe almost literally naked. He was a prehistoric man, probably a man, who was the first person to convince his fellow Neanderthals to go out hunting together rather than clubbing him over the head. And that is these two basic instincts we have for survival. One, survival of the fittest, to compete for resource, and one, to go out and hunt together. And at its basic essence, that is what diplomacy has been ever since. We're trying to provide those compromises, the negotiations that help the human species kind of rub along. And in the midst of all the change that you're leading, and I don't need to tell you about, my argument is that diplomacy is going to matter even more than ever, because you'll still need people as we go through this period of enormous transition, fastest changes ever. You'll still need people who can help societies and states and businesses and ideas rub along. Because when we've gone through even remotely similar periods of change in the past, think of the printing press, it has led to centuries of upheaval and conflict and war and loss of life on a massive scale. So somehow we're going to have to deal with the consequences of all this amazing stuff that you're doing. The unintended consequences of the technological change that you're leading will be huge political and social change. And so we're going to need some people in there trying to help us navigate through that. And all that's happening at a time when my business of diplomacy is itself being disrupted. I mentioned it's being disrupted by you guys, but it's being disrupted by many other actors in the media, the businesses that have their own foreign policy. I use the example often of the Murdoch empire, or even of Google, who actually run a very, very efficient foreign policy apparatus. We're being disrupted from all sides, and also from elsewhere in our own governments. And so again, we're trying to find ways to adapt, to disrupt ourselves, so we can still be competitive. But at the end of the day, and this has been really my journey, my lesson, coming through number 10 and feeling that power drain away as time sped up and we got adapted to 24/7 media and then social media. When I started, we cared about 140 words on the Sky Ticker. When I left number 10, we cared about 140 characters on Twitter. That whole sense of speeding up and how hard it is now for government to exercise the power we have. The result of all that is that I've got to the point where I've realized, and you've worked it out long before we have, that we just simply don't have the answers behind the wall. And so we're going to have to now form these different kinds of coalitions, unusual coalitions, in order to crack these massive problems ahead of us around the next energy source, around how do we get 75 million kids into school and out of potentially suicide vests. How do we find the balance between security and liberty online? How do we judge when it's right to go to war to protect the most vulnerable? Those are all issues that I'm basically saying, admitting, we can't crack. And so we're going to have to find ways to work with these new actors, often in competitive space, but find ways and synergies to try and crack those problems together, which is really where I'm most interested in taking the conversation later. If diplomacy didn't exist, my argument is that we would need to invent it to deal with the consequences of all this change, but it's now much too important to leave to the diplomats. So my case is that we need others, including all of you, to think of yourselves as citizen diplomats, to feel that you also have a responsibility to promote coexistence, to promote that idea, like my naked caveman, that we can collaborate rather than compete for resource. And this matters more than ever now in the 21st century, because the big dividing line is not north versus south, east versus west, rich versus poor. The big dividing line now, and we see it in the Brexit debate, we see it in the American presidential campaign, is between people who believe in that coexistence, rooms like this, where you're collaborating across cultures, across races, across religions, across ideas, between those people, the coexisters and the wall builders. And on the wrong side of that argument, you've got Islamic State, who don't just believe in attacking the West, they believe in attacking the grey zone where Islam and Christianity work together or live together. You've got the hard right in Europe becoming louder than ever. You've got the hard left in Europe becoming louder than ever. And of course you have the wall builder in chief, Donald Trump, arguing that basically the answer to the 21st century is just another layer of bricks at the top of that wall. So these arguments matter more than ever, but we need to build a much bigger and more effective coalition than we've ever had before if we're going to find the answers and the creativity and the ingenuity to help us survive the 21st century. Sounds a dramatic way to end it, but I think it is as important as that. Thank you.
So, fascinating introduction. One thing you talk about in your book over and over again is this idea of citizen diplomacy and how to avoid armchair activism. Can you start there?
Yeah, I mean, so my main worry about the about social media is the sort of slacktivism side of it. In Lebanon, we tried a number of things to cut through to people in completely different ways. So, for example, when the Iranian embassy was blown up, rather than deliver a speech, I couldn't go down and shake hands with the ambassador because we didn't have diplomatic relations. I went down and donated blood and then tweeted the photo, and it went viral in Tehran. And sort of, it was one way of showing the Iranian people that what they were being told about Britain and the West, just challenge it a little bit. And so we found ways to do things like that. They were stunts. And many of my colleagues said, these are just ridiculous attention-grabbing stunts. But they were stunts that had a purpose. We were trying to use these new tools, trying to build that plane as we flew it to find different ways to reach out and connect with people in a way my predecessors could never have done using traditional media.
Absolutely.
But in that space that we're competing for, you've got obviously the bad guys, and Islamic State are doing a fantastic job from their perspective of using gaming, for example, to radicalize people. And then you've got a bunch of people who are just being distracted, and for whom social media is making them a bit more apathetic, a bit more cynical. It's sort of switching them off. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why people are trusting my world of maps and chaps and hierarchies even less, but also why increasingly they have less trust in your world as well. Anything that looks like authority just provokes a sort of cynical backlash. And so somehow we have to find a way to ensure that people aren't just using social media just to flirt or look at pictures of cute cats.
It's interesting. So Tom goes through in great detail some of the more arcane traditions of diplomacy, and they're insane. They're absolutely insane, right? So like letting every other ambassador know that you'll be leaving the country.
By fax.
By fax before you go anywhere.
Yeah. Including people I'd never met before and had no intention of meeting.
So I can understand why perhaps some of these things maybe should be changed or adapted or adjusted.
Credentials is one of the others. That when you arrive in a country,
exactly.
You have this kind of 3-page letter from the Queen that explains that you are who you say you are, which you could do with a Google search now. And you wait for a month. You're not allowed to start work until you've presented your credentials to the leader. So you lose. In any other business, the first 90 days, you all know this, the most important time to really establish yourself and get up and running. Diplomats are often spending that time at home waiting for the phone call from the president's office to say you can come down and present this bit of paper to them.
So it seems to me like some of these traditions maybe should be disrupted regardless, or we're in line to be disrupted regardless. So I look at your book and I see how much you talk about what can we do, how can we change, how can we disrupt diplomacy. And technology helps, but I also wonder how much of a role your particular temperament played.
I think
it seems like you have a bit of a disruptive streak, or a bit of a.
You'd have to ask my former bosses.
But certainly,
I was quite lucky for a number of reasons. One was because I'd worked in Number 10. Everyone assumed I had somehow had sign off for what I was doing, and so I could get away with a bit more than I would have done otherwise. I was, as you said, I was a bit younger than most people doing the job, so I could do it looking a little bit less than like an uncle dancing to YMCA at a wedding. No, at times I failed on that. And I was also lucky, I think, because in Lebanon, because there's no real state, there's no real structure, there was no one to really complain about the fact that I was being quite critical of the leaders of the country. I could again get away with more outrageous, provocative stuff, and I could pick more arguments. And I needed to pick arguments because the people I was in competition with there were, Hezbollah, the Iranian regime, the Assad regime. Those were the people who I was fighting with in that on that digital battlefield.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about connection rather than connectivity, right? So it's very interesting to see how can you forge those real connections, and how can we as citizens do that. I think with that, I might actually open it up to the floor, if that's all right, because I otherwise will take up all of the time asking questions. Please, please wait for the microphone.
Do you see the nation state surviving to the end of the century? And if not, who will diplomats be representing at the end of the century?
I do, but mainly because I don't think we'll come up with a better idea. And there won't be a moment when people say, right, the nation state is now dead. But I do think that many individual states won't survive. And it's interesting now when you see states existing online before offline. Kosovo existed on Google Maps before it existed on the real map. And so there's a real challenge to the nation state. And I think what you will find is it's more of a slow ebbing of power away from the states and away from the systems of governance we've constructed around states. The problem is then what you put in its place. So when we had this problem in 1815, a bunch of people like me, although I probably wouldn't have been quite from the right social background to have been one of those people at the time, just went to Vienna for 6 months, representing states, and stitched up the world. Did the deal that lasted until the First World War. But who do you have in the room now? Do you go to Davos and try and do it there? Hopefully not. I think that's the biggest strength we have as nation states is the fact that no one quite has a better idea yet. It's not that nation states will be able to deliver all the things that people want them to themselves.
So professional diplomats, ambassadors, presumably were originally there to represent kings and queens and prime ministers to other kings and queens and prime ministers because communication was too slow, and so they had to. So now communication is fast, and kings and queens and prime ministers can talk to each other. What's the role of the professional diplomat?
Actually, there's a crossover actually between those two questions. Just very briefly, I'm going to just tell you that this time last year we debated sending an ambassador to Google. And you can see the logic of that. You think, okay, well, Google's coming up the list of power brokers, and we clearly have a whole bunch of issues to debate, cooperate on, argue about with Google. Arguably more, I won't pick a random country out of it, but arguably more than many countries. And so we really thought hard about this, but then decided, look, we hadn't sent an ambassador to previous commercial empires and corporates in the past. And ultimately, we as professional diplomats now represent states still. The technology point is really important. When the telephone came along, Palmerston, the then Foreign Secretary, said, my God, this is the end of diplomacy. And then when the fax came along, someone joked, well, you can replace the Foreign Office with a fax. At every stage, when the stirrup came along, I tell a story in here about how the horseback riding meant that one poor Chinese diplomat in 7th century BC was slow sliced, death by 1,000 cuts.
It's worth reading. Oh my God.
It's kind of post-watershed story. So there will always be a new piece of tech, and everyone will say, okay, now leaders can talk direct and so on. But I would argue, coming from my world, you still need people on the ground. People say, for example, now replace the diplomats with robots. And I'm doing a project at New York University. Can a robot do a better climate change deal than a diplomat? But I would argue you still need people who are curious and creative and have this focus on promoting coexistence on the ground and can speak the language and so on. I think we still have a head start, and there was still a place for the human in that process. But only if the human is using the technology as effectively as you are.
You list 3 different kinds of actors in your book, right? So those are who are obviously hostile, apparently friendly, and then local rivals for authority and influence. And you put tech companies in that second bucket, apparently friendly. Why apparently friendly?
So here, I mean, I'll give an example of a friendly and an example of an unfriendly then. I think I've got one project at the moment to get 1 million Syrian kids into school. And these are 1 million kids who are Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey. Imagine them as future Google employees, or imagine them as future, what they will be if they don't go to school. And we can't crack that problem as governments. And so what we're trying to do now as the Global Business Coalition is go out to people and go out to Uber and say, can you help us with the transport here? We're actually not looking for money. We're not looking for CSR in the classic sense. We're looking for your problem-solving abilities. We go out to Google or Facebook and say, can you help provide connectivity for the classrooms so we can get the devices and the education and the content on the devices into the kids' hands, getting school to kids, not kids to school. And we're going out to IKEA and Arup and saying, can you build the buildings? Again, don't give us cash. And in support of all that, we found this brilliant guy who's recently sold his tech company in California, who is not giving us half his profits, but is giving us now 3 days a month, trying to design the internet dating technology that means we can match people who want to help with people who need the help in both directions. So there's a whole ton of stuff there where we're clearly on the same side.
Yeah.
But then if you look at a lot of the security stuff, and Apple have obviously been in the midst of this recently, it's competitive. And it will have to be, because the second that the big tech companies are seen to be too close to government, then you're going to be pretty quickly disrupted yourselves. So there's a natural friction there and a natural competition. I also think another area of competition, by the way, I was at Cambridge University yesterday, and this room I'm sure is an example of this, you're going to be hoovering up the best talent. We can't recruit the best people anymore because they want to go and work at Google.
Interesting.
That's a very direct competition.
Right.
We can't pay them as much as you can. And your job, and they're also saying this is where the power is. We want to go where the action is.
So do you think it's power, or do you think it's interest?
Oh, and interest, I'm sure. I mean, and also your canteen is much better than ours. Yeah.
Fabulous. More questions from the floor. We've got one at the back, so if you could wait for the mic.
Thank you. We're seeing the erosion of the traditional nation state and this move towards direct digital democracy. But if you look at the recent thing about the naming of a boat and breaking boat face and all that, are people actually ready for that responsibility?
Yeah.
And is there a world that's even more scary than Mr. Trump due to the kind of frivolous nature of social media?
It's a really good question. It's a question that's always been asked, of course, at every stage of political change and democratization. And in the book, I've got some kind of great quotes from old diplomats, basically saying the problem with newspapers is people will think they have some influence over diplomacy and so on, then TV as well. My argument is that if you think the bottom line of my job of diplomacy is trying to prevent people dying in conflict. It's a very simple way of trying to capture it. And at every moment when there's been a greater democratization, where more people have had greater oversight of what I do, or we do in my world, fewer people have died violently. And we're now, of course, 200 times less likely to die violently than 100 years ago. So I see it on balance as a positive thing. The empowerment of the mob is a positive thing. But it does make my job harder. And August 2013 is a classic example of that. The debate over whether we should bomb Bashar al-Assad. Under the old rules, governments had decided we'd do it. US, UK, in we go. But of course, the reality was different. Post-Iraq, but also in a social media age when people are commenting in real time about the decisions you're taking, the UK Parliament said no. And then that gave Obama reason to pause, and in the end, not to do it either. And so, on balance, who knows, maybe a good thing. It's, it's very, the problem with making judgments in foreign policy is, of course, you never have hindsight. But it's an example of how actually it's harder if you're in the more transparent West. It's harder to do diplomacy because you can't bluff in the same way. You can't win that hand of poker against the more autocratic regimes against the Russians.
I did like that you note that not only does Putin ride at horseback, but he has the biggest plane at it.
He has by far the biggest plane. and
Diplomatic summit.
You can read all sorts of things into that. Berlusconi has a pretty big plane as well.
Exactly.
We arrived at one summit on a plane we borrowed from Led Zeppelin, and it had kind of leopard skin kind of seats and stuff like that. I think now the UK Prime Minister is now allowed his own plane at last, and about time too. That long overdue.
More questions from the floor. Got one over here, please.
So you see, as governments tend to lean more on digital tools in order to enable them to reach whatever they got, their goals. With this whole digital age thing coming about, how would you think, the cyber warfare aspect of things and the cyber espionage type of things will affect diplomacy and also the transparency within governments and certain regimes, etc.?
It's a really important point, and I think one of my great worries is that at the moment, as a result of Iraq, of Edward Snowden, of Julian Assange, the public doesn't actually trust us enough with their data to give us the power we need to take on the bad guys in that space. And when we're looking for evidence of terrorist planning and so on, what we're looking for is the needle in the haystack, but you've got to be able to look through the hay in order to find it. And that's going to become harder and harder because of that loss of trust in government. And so somehow, and it's something I'm trying to do in the book a bit, somehow we have to try and make the case afresh to people for why we can be trusted. Why we're not, some great kind of Watergate type conspiracy and all we really want to do is read your emails. But, I think we're losing that argument at the moment. And that is a threat to our collective survival because it gives an advantage to people who want to threaten and terrorize our societies. By the way, though, one of the best follows I'd recommend on Twitter at the moment is GCHQ. CIA were great when they first came on as well, but imagine if you're trying to design a Twitter account for a spy agency. It feels like something you get at an interview to try and challenge you. And the trick is, of course, to just find a way to be authentic. And GCHQ tweet maths puzzles and say, we love maths. Can you try this out and see if you're clever enough to work for us? But also they're proud of their history, quite rightly. And so they tweet stuff from the history that they can talk about. And I think that's a pretty effective Twitter account. And if you like maths puzzles, they're great.
That's fabulous. I have a quick question about the Official Secrets Act. So your book has gone through the Official Secrets Act. What was that like?
It wasn't too bad. Actually, I used to do this when I was inside government. One of the things I used to oversee was clearing of books by rogue diplomats. And so I kind of knew where the line was. And I've taken out lots of kind of very salacious and racy stuff from other people's books. Clearly, you can't talk about specific examples of intelligence work.
Yeah.
I think you have to be a bit careful if you're talking about serving leaders, quite rightly. Especially if you're talking about, if I was spilling the beans, I'm sorry it's not in here, we'd make it a more interesting book. If I was spilling the beans on what David Cameron thought of Angela Merkel, I think someone in government should take that out, to be honest. Because that's not going to, it's fun, it's salacious, but it's not going to help anyone. So I was trying to steer on the right side of that line when I was writing it. In fact, in the end, the one thing that got taken out was a reference to representation. And it's quite an academic thing, this. I was saying I didn't feel I was just Her Majesty's Ambassador, HMA, but I felt like I was the British people's ambassador. I was representing Bond and Beckham and Benedict Cumberbatch and all the rest of it. And the feeling was that might not go down well with the palace. I've discussed it with the palace. They're quite relaxed. They do feel that that's what ambassadors do. You represent the wider national brand, and that it's as important to represent that soft power as it is to represent as to judge your power by how many bullets you can sell.
Absolutely. More questions from the floor.
So, how do you evaluate a diplomat? It was mentioned in the introduction that you were one of the youngest ambassadors out there. I always imagine that diplomacy is a very hierarchical, I guess, industry. There are no shortcuts. You have to do your time as a junior attaché in some exotic country, and again, and again, and so on. So can you comment on that?
It is very hierarchical. It's opening up. And so you've got lots of slightly younger people coming through slightly earlier. Although it's very striking for me moving out of a business where I always felt I was the youngest person in the room. And now I'm kind of doing things where often I'm the oldest in the room. You get, much like anyone else, you get evaluated every year. You get an annual appraisal. And they will look at the key competences. I guess you go through similar things, working with others, leadership, problem solving, and so on. I've just done a big review of the Foreign Office, and what we're trying to reorientate towards is looking at the skills as well. We've gone a bit too far in the direction of competences and away from the skills. So we need to get back to evaluating people's courage and creativity and curiosity and so on. Those things that have always made diplomats very, very good. You go through, there's an assessment center kind of halfway through your career, which is very, very hard to get through. Before you become a diplomat, you have a year of being tested and assessed, and they go out. Maybe this is something that Google, in its terribly sinister way, is now doing, but they used to go out and talk to, you'd give them 3 names from your life of people who knew you. They would ask those 3 people for 3 more, and then 3 more. They'd fan out until they got to people who you didn't really know. And then they would ask the truth about what you were like. And then they'd get you back in and say, so that time at that youth hostel in Jerusalem on the roof when this happened, and you'd be so shocked. The whole idea of that was that they wanted to ensure that you weren't blackmailable. They weren't going to kick you out because you'd smoked something funny at some stage or you'd spent the night with someone funny at some stage. It was all about ensuring they had all the information that our opponents could otherwise use to blackmail you.
Fascinating question just behind.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me when you were talking earlier about the culture that you wanted to build seemed very similar to Google. We want a collaborative environment, and we're quite fanatical about protecting that. And if we start to see that it's shifting one direction or another, we have entire departments dedicated to that. How do diplomats think about shaping culture, and is there stuff we could learn from you guys or vice versa?
I think actually one thing that that British diplomats do very well is share information. You think in most institutions like the Foreign Office, there'd be a hoarding of information. And that's a kind of classic kind of hierarchical thing to do. And I can pretty much guarantee that this morning, our Perm Rep, our ambassador in New York, is going into the Security Council with more information than anyone else in the room, because he will have read this morning reports. We call them telegrams, but they're really like kind of long emails. They're not really kind of telegrams. From all the relevant countries that they're debating that day in the hall. And he'll have got a message from number 10. He'll have got messages from the Foreign Office. And his people will have curated all that data in a way that means he's got that head start. It's amazing how often, as a British diplomat, other diplomats come to you to ask what's happening in their capital, because they're hoarding information to a much greater degree. So that, I think, is perhaps the key thing, the key strength that I would try to take from the world I was in into other worlds.
Does the lobbying industry provide an effective diplomacy channel for non-state actors like Google to nation states?
I think it's making lots of people very rich. I think there's lots that and I try to do this in the book, that we can learn from watching lobbyists and how they operate in order to be better diplomatic lobbyists, which is one of the core things that we do. I was frustrated in number 10 that in 4 years I was lobbied a lot by arms dealers, but I wasn't lobbied anything like enough by NGOs. And yesterday I went to talk to a group of NGOs to say, here's how you can be more effective. Here are the moments when you can really change our views inside government. I think that, lobbyists, they wouldn't exist if they weren't moderately effective, but they're much less effective than they tell you when they're pitching.
You talked there about summarizing information, and Google's always tried to make information accessible by making it searchable, so you can access everything with the right search phrases, whereas what you described for our ambassadors was much more about really effective summarization. Do you think there's things that either side could do better in that?
Yeah, I mean, we're woeful at knowledge management. And so when I used to go and meet a Lebanese warlord, he'd been there for 30 years and would have basically in his head the kind of Rolodex of all his previous contacts with British ambassadors. And I would be going in there without any of that. When we haven't found a really good way to conserve the data, the knowledge that we have. And so again, one of the things we're trying to do at New York University now is build like a Diplopedia, which is almost your knowledge archive as an institution. And so that when you go to a meeting, you have a kind of Diplo bot or an app or a gadget that basically runs through it and tells you, okay, this is the guy, 10 years ago he did this, 15 years ago he told the ambassador this is the time that he mucked up, this is the time that he screwed us over, this is the time that he collaborated with us, and just gives you a much better sort of sense of your historical relationship with that individual. So that's something I think we could really learn from the outside world. The reality is that Google is doing that for us at the moment. Google is our best tool for that at the moment. And yet still inside the Foreign Office. I mean, this is a problem for me. If you Google Naked Diplomat inside the Foreign Office, you get the hand saying inappropriate content. But it's, you'd find everyone in the Foreign Office using Google a huge amount.
It's interesting. I think the question really around how do you summarize and collate and access the right bits of institutional memory at the right time is absolutely incredible. I think, though, it's very difficult. This warlord with all of his memories, if you were to look at those in the whole, there'd be far too much information to ever ingest or use usefully.
But that's
it's the
why
situational and contextual clues, isn't it?
That's why if you can be the person that can curate that knowledge and work out what to do with it, that is a position of real power now, I think.
Interesting.
You said you talked about sending an ambassador to Google, and I guess the answer was certainly not yet. What would be the trigger that would actually make it happen?
Yeah. I think in reality what would happen is you'd send a representative. It wouldn't necessarily be someone who would be called an ambassador, because that then basically suggests the nation state is finished and you're looking at a different model, in which case people would say, well, why is it the British government that chooses to send one or not? I think what you will see happening, I mean, we already have a really good consul general in LA, for example. I think you'll find that those hubs near where tech companies are will grow and grow and grow, and you'll increasingly send better and better people to those places, because it's a recognition, and that's where the arguments are and the potential ideas are. The problem for us inside government is we're still effectively saying to tech companies, I think, okay, here are the issues we care about, please come into our conversation. And I imagine that's a bit of a turn-off. We've got to find ways to say, okay, what are the things we can crack together? What are the problems we can solve together? But yeah, I don't know. This debate about should Google come onto the Security Council, that would be a trigger to send someone to Google.
Hi. You said that the role of diplomats is to foster cooperation, and sort of lightly touched on the topic of Brexit. What do you think about EU and what would happen to diplomacy if the UK were to leave or not to leave? What do you think should happen?
When I used to advise PMs before press conferences, I'd always say, be careful towards the end of the press conference, because that's when you start to relax, and that's when you kind of let your guard down and give the answer you weren't planning to. And this is the end of the week of book tour. This is the last event, actually. And so I arrived conscious, right, I'm not going to go and say the wrong thing on Brexit, but then... so forgive me for being... all my stuff is about being open and honest and more transparent about what we do, except when it comes to my views on Brexit, where I spent the whole week trying not to answer that question. I'm really worried about the way the debate has gone. I don't think that Britain is a country that needs to be scared of the world, and the debate, I fear, on both sides has been far too much characterised by fear. We must leave Europe because those terribly frightening people in Brussels are dominating our lives. Or we must stay in Europe because if we don't, we'll never survive in the 21st century. I don't believe that either of those views. And it's certainly the country I was representing, trying to represent in Lebanon, was much more confident and outward-looking, and aware of its role in the world and its history. We've we've been at our best when we've been outward-looking and open-minded and sought new ideas and markets. You see, I'm not answering the question at all, am I? But as I said earlier on, I'm up for coexistence and opposed to building walls, and so that gives you a bit of a clue. I should explain why I'm not answering the question, which is that we're in a period called Purda, where current civil servants and recently resigned civil servants aren't supposed to give a view on the referendum. So sorry, that's why I have to be so boring.
If we perhaps took a step back and looked at things a little bit more abstractly, as opposed to talking about Brexit directly, let's just say we took one step back and.
You should be on the TV. This is.
Well, you know, I do what I can, but I have a genuine question around unpicking the EU or unpicking any set of complicated agreements. Is probably outside of something I'm capable of doing as an informed citizen.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at not Brexit, but a complicated set of external engagements and agreements, what's the role for citizen diplomacy or citizen democracy there? How can we meaningfully and relevantly engage, and to what extent can we meaningfully or relevantly engage?
It's true, actually. I think that's in a way a reason why either outcome actually will have lots of officials kind of licking their lips, because there will be a real job for them to do. and in a situation where for example, we were dealing with Brexit, there'd be masses of work, and it would have to be done by the professional diplomats.
Yeah.
So there would be they would be at the centre of things actually in that context.
Then how can citizens make those choices and decisions?
I think that's a really good point. I would hope that anyone running that negotiation would be trying to find ways to engage people and involve them more in the decisions we would need to take, so that it wouldn't all be done behind the curtain by the institutions. But I think also as individuals, you would need to be challenging government at that moment, and saying, we're simply that vote, whichever way the Brexit vote goes, the public have basically been saying, we're fed up of everything being stitched up in this way. We want more of a say over where power is going and how it's exercised. So hopefully that gives people a bit more leverage with government to hold them to account and to influence specific decisions rather than waiting every 5 years for an election.
Right.
But that's going to take more direct democracy.
Got time for another 2 questions. One in the back row.
Can you follow up about agreements like TTIP that are being negotiated in secret, and people do not really have any influence about that? And a second one would be similar to this, because and touching also on the surveillance, because we have seen in the past that surveillance has been abused time and again to actually stop people from having any influence. So can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I think on the second one, that it comes back to the point about how difficult it is for us to build the trust we need to keep people secure now, because we don't have a great history of doing it in the right way. But genuinely in my experience, having been in that world, if you go down to Cheltenham, where we have our government communication headquarters that does the monitoring work, you will find a bunch of people who are incredibly motivated and real kind of public servants and very professional. And I just wish there was a way of almost demonstrating that more effectively, of showing that actually that there are strong values at the heart of many of these institutions. But it's a very difficult argument to win while being secretive about, and there to be secretive about what you do. There will always be a role for secrecy in the negotiations on the first point. And there's always a role, the Iran deal was done mainly in secret. I wasn't in the room live tweeting the Iran deal, just as well. So there is still a part of diplomacy which has to be confidential. Just as, there's a part of your world when you're negotiating to buy a company that has to be done in secret. And that won't go away anytime soon. my argument in the book is that we have to find a way to try to explain that, to communicate with people, to explain why it has to be secret, rather than just saying it's all a bit too complicated.
Great. One more question.
So you mentioned citizen diplomacy before. What would you recommend, or what is there that we can actually do now to fight against building walls and our ideals for the world?
Amazing note to finish on.
Yeah, brilliant note to finish on. I think pick the right argument, take on the people who are on the wrong side of the argument, think about how you can use the smartphone superpower that you have to get into those debates in the right way. Don't just assume that someone else will do that for you. I think, but you know, you're doing this all already. I mean, being kind of curious and open-minded about the world and taking on those people who are getting more and more narrow and introverted, joining the right campaigns, building the as you are doing, building the ideas that we don't yet know we need, but we'll soon find out we can't live without. And then really taking on these big challenges I mentioned around the next energy source, around what we do about managing the new weapons, the debates about when we go to war and when we don't go to war, the debates around the balance between security and liberty that we've touched on online. Those are all debates that you should clearly all be in, and that shouldn't just be happening behind the walls. So I'd basically say sort of seize the smartphone, get stuck in.
Fabulous. Well, Tom, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Naked Diplomacy.
Thank you very much. Thank you.